Well, one of the things I said yesterday when I was talking with a spectacularly bright group of residents is that I end up learning far more when I get to come. So I never turn these opportunities down because I get to learn about a new morning, Nathan. How'd it go last night? All right.
Yeah, great.
Okay. What's that? I don't want any details. I'm fine. But one of the things that is important, you get, part of our job, obviously, at Penn, like every other academic program, is educating residents. And so it's nice to see that you guys sit in the exact same spot that the Penn residents do, as far from the podium as you possibly can be. That way it's hard for me to distinguish who's out there in case I have a question for you.
That's where your hockey arena is, right?
What's that?
Don't you guys have a hockey thing going on right now?
Don't we have a hockey thing going on right now? Yeah, it was great. I was loving the headlines of the paper today with Sid the Kid on the front. And we don't know whether we're going to call him Sid the Whiner or Sid the Kid, but our Flyers are doing. In many years, the Flyers have a great record, and they just sink in the playoffs. And right now, we've got an unusually hot goalie, as you know. And actually, I don't think that we're the dirtier of the two groups, but I'm from Philadelphia. So anyway, Andrew is putting me on the spot here. I gave him. We've had a little bit of email correspondence back and forth, and he said, "Well, what do you want to speak?" What I said, "Well, here are the things I can speak on," and he sent me an email back that had included none of the things that I had on my list to speak on, and I sent him another one back, and two times in a row he wanted me to speak about minimally invasive surgery, and. The reason is that we had a really nice week together in Cartagena a couple of years ago, and I gave a talk similar to this one there. It's not my, first of all, I'll tell you, I've never done a minimally invasive, I've never done a laparoscopy all by myself. And I've never, and my stone endourologic skills are pretty primitive. And so when they asked me to do it in Cartagena, I felt equally uncomfortable. So really what I'm going to talk about today is how we took our program from a program that had really no MIS to a program that I think is one of the leaders now in MIS and pediatric urology. And I'll tell you a little bit about how we went about making this work for us. Because I think there is relevance to many programs. And so this is not really going to be, at least for the residents, a way to illuminate a lot about MIS techniques, although there's some things here that I've learned from Pat Cassell and Sarah Lambert that have run our program. But it's mostly about how we were able to put a program together at CHOP. So let's see now. Sorry, Jason, I knew I'm failing right at the very beginning here. Okay, great, thank you. So the evolution of MIS in surgery begins in 1901. The first ablative surgery in 1974. By the 90s, which is even after the time that I trained, cholecystectomy became common, so our general surgical team mates sort of led the way with laparoscopic surgery, at least initially. The first ablative surgery in urology was in 1989. The first pyeloplasty was Luke Cavusi in 1995, followed, or actually just short of that was Craig Peters in pediatrics. But the first laparoscopic reconstruction was not done until 9 years later at CHOP. So we were really pretty far behind, in my view, at that point, and it began to worry me. We have been lucky at CHOP in that that there's been a heritage of big volume of surgery at CHOP, and beginning with John Duckett's mentorship in 1969, he was able to. Based on his unusual skill and broad and deep personality, was able to attract a lot of patients to CHOP. And so in 1995, we were doing 12,000 outpatients, about 1,400 cases a year. There were 4 staff, lots of open surgery, lots of business. And the MIS work, the potential MIS work, we estimated was only about 20%. So we were doing largely diagnostics at that time. And in fact, at the young age of 41, I gave a talk at the, or 40, I gave a talk at the plenary session at the AUA and said that there was very little role in my estimation for laparoscopic surgery for cryptorchidism. And I realized later that when you make an open comment like that at a plenary session, you date yourself and probably hurts your program a little bit because it makes it look like you're backward thinking. And so my sense was at that point, we were leaders in open surgery, why change? And that is exactly the kind of thinking that got our automakers in big trouble, and Intel, IBM, all of the big leaders. When you begin to look behind you rather than ahead of you, it's the beginning of the death knell to a very solid program. And so my point, though, is that if you look at personalities, and psychologists have mapped this out, there's a curve that has to do with how rapidly you adopt new techniques. And we could actually, with some assessment, you can actually profile everybody in this room, and we'd line up in a curve like this, where you've got innovators, early adopters, an early majority, a late majority, and then laggards. And although I don't think we'd call ourselves laggards at CHOP, we hadn't pushed really hard to develop this new technology. And I was beginning to feel like our ability to attract the best and brightest fellows, which we've been very proud to have been able to do over the years, was going to begin to lag because the fellows really wanted to learn these new techniques. So by 2000, our numbers had climbed. But by 2002, I began to think that we really had to go and look for an individual to come to build a program at CHOP. There's a broad heritage, and one of the reasons I think that John Duckett had been so successful in building pediatric urology at CHOP began with Chick Coop. We've been doing this to the residents all week, or all last 24 hours. Does anybody in the back there know who C. Everett Koop is? Any hands? Nobody knew who Bob Jeffs was. No one knew, who else was it that we talked about? No, we didn't talk about Hardy. What was it?
Last name started with C, she said.
Last name started with C. They didn't know John Duckett, but anyway, Chick Coop was brought over by Jonathan Rhodes and I.S. Rabden just after World War II, actually during World War II, to CHOP to become the first pediatric surgeon that was focused just at CHOP. But Coop's vision that he put together over the next 20 years at CHOP was to subdivide pediatric surgery into areas of excellence. And so just as general adult surgery began to be broken down into groups, Coop had the same vision for pediatric surgery, and actually was the first one, at least in our country, to establish pediatric neurosurgery, pediatric urology, pediatric ENT, and even pediatric plastic surgery. And that actually had never been done. The pediatric surgeons, even in Boston, had been the surgeons of the skin and everything inside. And so beginning in the mid to late 60s, C. Everett Koop began that. And so I had a broad feeling that the same thing that was happening, that we see happening in adult urology, should be at least begun to work in pediatric urology if you had a big enough team to be able to pull that off. And we did. I thought that as our growth increased, we wanted to begin to focus on our own individuals being the top 2 or 3 or 4 in whatever field, 2 or 3 fields that they wanted to do within pediatric urology. So by 2004, we were up to 20,000 outpatients a year. and more than 2,000 children per year are operated on by 6 staff. Lots of open surgery, lots of business. Again, behind in our MIS program. And in pediatric urology, it was a lot of fun. You did get to do a potpourri of all different types of things. But when you start to think about the volume of information that we have to assimilate, pediatric urology had gone from about 20 articles a month in 1987 when I started looking at the world's literature to more than 200 articles a month currently. And I do this thing for the Journal of Urology called the Urologic Survey, and so I actually do look at this every month. And if you map it out, there's an exponential amount of information that we have to be expert at. And at CHOP anyway, as here, you can't be behind. You have to be operating at a very high level. And I began to think, and of course, I personalize it. My brain clearly is not big enough to manage that kind of information and be expert at it on a regular basis. And so I had a pretty deep-seated belief that people ought to begin to sub-specialize. Now, it's tricky to do that. It's easy for me because, not necessarily because of my skill, but because of the chair I sit in, I get a tremendous number of referrals from all around the country, and so I'm never short of work. But for me to impose subspecialization on my team, it's got to be done very gently. Because we all like to do hypospadias, we all like to do stone work, we all like to do major reconstruction within the abdomen. And the real question then begins to be, what is best for the child? We talked a little bit about the medical knowledge. I began, at least in my view, from a strategic standpoint, to begin to look at a reconstructive group, a neurourology group, an MIS group, and then an endourology group. And as I mentioned just now, I think that we've always had the approach that every baby that walks in, and I'm sure that all of you feel this way with all of your patients, but I've never felt good and never ever offered a surgery to a child that and the mother and father that I wouldn't have done on my own child. And our commitment then to teaching is also to produce the best, and I've always believed that if you had an expert in various areas, the residents rotating through would get exposed to the best female urologist, for example, not in pediatric urology, but in adult urology. We've got a great female urology team, we've got great endourology, we've got great lap work, and the residents can migrate back and forth. And even though no one of us can manage all of those areas, the residents get exposed to the best, and then they can choose which area they want to go into. There's a big problem, however, is that there's a financial trade back and forth, because some of the, as we know, some of the subspecializations pay better than others, and so as the chief, you have to be able to figure out a way to balance the finances, because at CHOP, like many other program south of the border, we use the term that you eat what you kill, meaning that you have to attract the patients in your office and then operate on them and then collect, and that more or less goes into our column. And so if you have one guy who's struggling with major reconstructions in patients that don't pay very well, you've got to figure out a way to equalize that with a guy who might be doing a ton of stone work where the global period is short, and there's just a tremendous amount of procedure-based work, which still pays in the States about 4 to 1 over E&M outpatient type work. So there are real challenges. But the centers of excellence that we came up with were the ones that I talked about. We actually have a neuropathic bladder dysfunctional voiding group, which is heavily outpatient based. You need to see 10 of those patients before you're going to book a single surgery in the Dove group. And then we have a big basic science research piece and an outcomes research piece that we're trying to nurture along. This is, I think, an interesting diagram that you've all seen, but this is the U.S. Patent and Transfer Office utility patent grants, and you can see that in 1979, just under 50,000 compared with well over 200,000 by projected to 2011. I haven't seen the 2012 numbers yet, but this begins to jump in leaps and bounds. In a sagging economy, the patents are down generally, but in a booming economy, they accelerate again as research cranks up. So the concept of we talked about where did you train, and we were joking. I was joking with the residence team last night that that pediatric urologists can kind of train can kind of trace their lineage back to 2 or 3 people in the country: David Innes Williams, Herbert Johnston, and 1 or 2 others perhaps in France and Germany. But I don't believe that concept of where you train is going to last for very much longer, because the technology is advancing so rapidly that we're also going to have to leave room for mid-level training for individuals that, for example, need to keep pace, which means that, and that's very expensive to do. We are looking, to train some of our 40 and 50-year-olds in minimally invasive, and we sat down and figured out, how do you do that? Well, Mike Carr, for example, I'll use him as an example, bills about $2 million a year. So to pull him out for a year of specialized training, which would need to be done because we can't train a fellow and Mike Carr at the same time without either disappointing the fellow or disappointing Mike, or both. And we also don't believe at CHOP that you get to do a few cases and then learn on children, because that sort of violates one of the central mission pieces that we have, and that is that if we're going to be the top program in the country, the top 2 or 3 people, then if I have somebody who's come from New York City because they don't feel comfortable in New York and want Pat Casale to do their robotic reimplant, they shouldn't be getting Mike Carr and Pat looking on. And I think they understand the fact that we're training fellows, but it's difficult because even though we're funneling somewhere around 60 to 70 RAL cases to Pat a year, that still is not probably quite enough to train a fellow and an attending as well as we should. So we're trying to balance all these things all the time. But we thought it was going to take Mike an investment of around $200,000 in his billings to get trained midway. And so we actually have raised a fund for simulation at CHOP to try to combat that. But that's sort of another story that we're working on. Success in a program where you begin to subspecialize is only successful if globally your partners trust one another, which means that I can't get Mike Carr to send a pyeloplasty in a 6-year-old to Pat Casale unless he believes fundamentally that Pat is going to send him something, of something else that Mike does particularly well. And secondly, I'm not the type of leader that's going to impose that on people, because your job satisfaction goes way down if you feel like you're particularly good at something. And certainly in this country, in the States anyway, our outcomes is so primitive. Our outcomes information that we have right now is so primitive that although I do a ton of hypospadias work, I have no way of knowing whether my work is as good or better than any of my partners. And so you can't hold a placard up right now and say that unless your hypospadias work gets better, you're going to have to hand it over to someone else. Nor is that probably the right thing to do anyway if you're going to try to keep a team together. So what I did when I first saw Pat Casale do in 2004, it was August 2004, I had done most of the open adrenal surgery up until that time at CHOP, and Scott Adzik's team, of course, does a fair amount of it. But most of the urologic adrenal work I had been doing. And I remember watching Pat do one laparoscopically, And I remember leaning over as I was watching him work, and this was like August of 2004. And I now know, because the way Pat tells the story is that he was sweating a lot because I was in the room while he was doing it. But I remember leaning over and whispering in his ear, well, I guess this is the last, I've just done my last adrenal. Because he'd done a beautiful job laparoscopically in removing the adrenal, and I was absolutely convinced that, my thoracoabdominal incision or high abdominal incision was no longer what I would have my daughter Caroline have at that point, which meant that I was out of the business. And so either I had to retrain in MIS and try and get as good as Pat has been over a career of doing it. I might even add that, my generation, we played asteroids, and we thought that was really cool in this huge box. And I remember, buying 3 hot dogs at lunch in medical school and playing asteroids and drinking Cokes and thinking that that was pretty high tech. Now, my kids are playing, my 20-year-old is kind of a gamer, and he plays games. He's tried to get me to play with him, and I can't even, move the soccer player over to the side. But, it's like, it would be like me trying to go out and skate with Gretzky. By the time I've moved over to where the ball was, the ball's on the other side of the field. And I think that, so, again, I'm projecting on myself because there's some really talented people that have picked this up, in mid-training. But you have to have a willingness to turn away from your practice to do that, which means time and money need to be donated in order to do that. Not everybody's ready to do that. I mean, my administrative work is such that I really can't afford to put that on hold, put my hypospadias and exstrophy practice on hold in order to jump into MIS. That doesn't mean that nobody should do that on our team, but you have to be thinking about this as it evolves. And so I think that, in my case anyway, picking up laparoscopic surgery at 54 would be a little bit like me picking up skiing at 54. And I'm sure that I could learn to ski blues and greens reasonably well, but unfortunately at a place like CHOP, you got to be able to ski double blacks if you're going to be in the business. And so in a way, we're handicapped a little bit by our position and maybe some arrogance that comes with that. And that's why I worry a little bit about CHOP as we evolve through this. So it takes talent. You've got to have a great minimally invasive guy. It takes trust. It takes commitment. We have to face our fears, which means that we have to be able to admit, what is the best for our children. And I think it starts with any of us that have our own children. What would you have Caroline Canning have or Maddie Canning have? And the answer is not always me, even though I have got great surgical judgment with regard to which patients probably need a pyeloplasty. I now believe that in anybody over about 8 months of age, I'm going to want it done by a minimally invasive surgery. And I also believe deeply that if you have equally intelligent, two equally intelligent surgeons, and one person gets to do 100 MIS cases a year, and the other guy gets to do 10 MIS cases a year, it's not going to be very long before the guy who's doing 100 is just going to get better at it. You get into a zone. We were talking about this the other day. I think that if you're doing something over and over again, you kind of get into a zone where it just isn't as hard for you to do it. I can do complex hypospadias like falling off a log. I've done a ton of hypospadias cripples. I don't fear those procedures. I don't sweat them too much anymore because I have had a huge referral base, as opposed to some of the other guys on my team who, if they've got to do a buckle and there's no skin and, they're going to put it in the scrotum. I have been down that road enough times that I know what it's going to look like at the end. And you can convey that sort of confidence to patients, but it doesn't come without a big book of surgery. And so my sense was to continue with this and yet do it in a gentle way. Now, this is a slide that Pat shared with me. I sort of, once again, I was, a young man when the concept of transformers comes up. This is Omega Prime, which is the mix of Optimus Prime and God Magnus, which is sort of the maximal uber transformer. And the way we think about our program is that, you be arms, you be legs, and collectively, the parts are greater than, or collectively the whole is greater than the parts, as long as everything is really working well. And I can tell you that it requires constant maintenance. I have to be in and out of people's office if they feel like they're not getting the surgeries that they need to do, and nobody wants to do a whole pile of trade a whole pile of circumcisions, for example, for pyeloplasties. By 2010, we were up to 2,600 outpatients. Last year we did 2,450 babies. We had 7 staff, 6 of whom were operating, and we were really pretty solidly into this algorithm. Now, I will tell you that it was largely Pat Casale who built the MIS piece. This is another slide of his. He's a New Yorker. His point, though, here is in this sort of involved Venn diagram is that you've got reconstruction and oncology over here, a lot of which can be done MIS. You've got andrology over here, and then MIS, and we've got all these sort of sub-programs that are mixed in here. And balancing it all becomes very, very important. I think that's really the chief's job to make sure that that happens. Now, I have a deep-seated belief in the fact that, and there's a lot of talk about, small incisions. I think small incisions are great, but I also believe that being able to operate in situ is probably more important. This is not my surgery, but Pat won't tell me actually who was doing this particular operation, but at our program. But this was done at CHOP, and when I see this kind of thing where you've got a ureter that's being pulled way out of the retroperitoneum, and into the wound, I mean that's not doing anybody any good. And this isn't one that we got off the web. This is one of our own group doing this work. The MIS obviously brings you right down to the level of the organ, and I think that's important. Now, one of the things that I've studied in a basic way is wound healing. Scott Adzik, who has built a huge fetal surgical program at CHOP, part of the work that they were doing, at least initially, was a follow-on to Mike Longacre's work that was done in the first fetal program out at San Francisco. But they were looking basically at the recruitment of inflammatory cytokines. And we now know that the amount of inflammatory cytokine that you get, which then invokes fibroblast migration and scarring, is based on a lot of different things. It's based on the depth of the wound, whether it's a dirty or a clean wound, and also the length of the wound. So the point is that 5 MIS incisions that are each a centimeter doesn't equal 1 5-centimeter incision, which has been something that people have said a lot before. The truth is that it just doesn't. And Thane Blinman, excuse me, pardon me, Thane Blinman at CHOP has shown that total tension on the wound, we talked a little bit about tension on the bladder yesterday, but total tension on the wound rises nonlinearly with increasing wound length, and that's just a physical property that you can prove with basic physics. So the total tension across multiple incisions is less than the total tension for the incision of the same total length. And a 2-centimeter incision is 2.7 times more wound tension than 3 5-millimeter incisions. So if you believe that wound tension, like depth, and the quality of the wound also increases recruitment, and of course we know that tension in the bladder and tension in any hollow organ results in increased fibrosis. Then there's another reason why the minimally invasive approach really probably should displace and will displace, I'm convinced, open surgery over time, because the instruments are just going to get smaller. So at this point, as the leader of the team, I got out of the business of doing any abdominal surgery in patients over 8 months. And I got to tell you that that every time a patient came in that needed an abdominal operation, I had to fight this battle within myself every time, because no surgeon wants to not do what they love doing. And that is, and there's nothing that I felt like I didn't think there's anybody better than me in my abdominal surgical skills, and yet, and I kept going back to Caroline Canning, and so I basically handed all these over, and I made it public. I mean, I talked about it all the time, up and down. We have a row of offices at CHOP, and I walked up and down and said, I made a big deal out of the fact that I was sending this patient to Pat, and whenever, and we review all the cases that we're going to do every Friday or every Wednesday for the next week. And when when an 18-month-old was going to have an open surgery, I kind of made a note of it. And I never talked about it until after the surgery was over, but I would always circle back and say, that 18-month-old, do you really think that this patient would have done better with, MIS? And they'd say, no, I think I can do just as good a job, and my times are better. And so the next time I would come back and say, well, actually your times aren't any faster. They're slower. And these patients are on average staying 2.5 times longer in the in the hospital. The other thing I have a deep-seated belief about is that we have been living the good life south of the border for a long time, and because our country used to be really wealthy, if you looked at value-based care as defined by value equals cost or equals outcomes over cost, forever, as long as we were improving outcomes, the denominator was not anything we had to worry about, because there seemed to be an infinite amount of money that patients and their families had to spend on getting even 2 or 3% better outcome. And that can be measured by, or better value, and that can be measured by fewer days in the hospital or better results. And now it's not like that anymore. Now we really have to begin, and we will have to begin. It's going to happen soon. I think it's going to happen within the next 24 months, that we're going to actually have to be able to show real value. So when you begin to think about the length of stay and the time that doesn't even include the time off for families, the effect on the gross domestic product for the United States of having a skilled surgeon out of work for a day or two while his baby's being operated, or a skilled economist, or even a guy who's running a hedge fund. Their opportunity cost away from work isn't even factored into a lot of the stuff that we do when we talk about hospital. We're just talking about hospital costs. But really, the real cost of that family is the time away from work while this baby recuperates. And it doesn't end when they leave the hospital. If the baby's home recuperating for 3 or 4 additional days at home, that has to be factored in as well. So all of a sudden now, we're looking at huge differences in cost. So I just talked it. I talked it all the time, and gradually people began turning more and more cases over to Pat. So why use the robot? Well, we talked a little bit about it. I think costs. There's no tactile feedback, and I think that those of you that do a lot of lap work and don't use the robot, I think worry a little bit about that. That's going to be worked on, but I think it's going to be a long time before we actually get that response. There has also been, I think, a little bit of problem with Intuitive, really putting the money that they need to in R&D, because they've had the market cornered for quite a while. But those patents are going to begin to run out, and I think we'll start to see real improvements in the robot as time goes on. But there's better vision, enhanced instruments, precision. It's easier for the surgeon. It may even actually lengthen a surgical career, because you're sitting on a console and you're much more comfortable than you are when you're having to operate the instruments, because you got a couple more degrees of freedom with the robotic arms. And when the snake arms that are not even depicted here come out, it makes it even easier. I'm not here to talk about the robot per se. I think most of you know what it's capable of doing. It probably doesn't make as much difference in ablative surgery. I know Pat Casal at our program removes lymph nodes, for example, does retroperitoneal lymph node dissection without the robot. But anytime he's doing reconstruction, anytime that significant sewing is required, he uses the robot for that. And so for a program like Pediatric Urology, where you're doing largely reconstruction rather than ablative surgery, it makes a lot of difference. I think there are certainly some issues. Pat mentions the stress in the practice. He would come to me and say, I don't know if this is sustainable here, because the more of these abdominal cases that I do, the more resentment I feel, either overtly or covertly from the rest of the team. And I think fundamentally Pat thinks that everybody will be trained in the robot as time goes on, and we'll start to be like Back to the Future. I have a son that's at Dartmouth College right now, which is where C. Everett Koop is at 95 or 94. So every now and then I have lunch with him when I go up there, and he said that one of the great shames of pediatric surgery has been that as more and more people have been trained in pediatric surgery, and I don't mean just pediatric general surgery, but pediatric urology, but Coop in this case was talking about pediatric surgery. He said that esophageal atresia procedures, that they hit their peak at CHOP. They did 18 in 1967 and 19 in 1968, and then there's been a gradual diminution in the numbers of kids that have been operated on at CHOP for esophageal atresia. Why? Because more and more people are trained around the country, so these kids didn't have to come to CHOP for that work. The downside is that if you might not even see a case of esophageal atresia, as I understand it anyway now, as a pediatric surgical resident. And the same can be said about bladder exstrophy. In 1970, at Sick Kids in Toronto, Bob Jeffs closed 20 exstrophies. In 1969 at CHOP, John Duckett closed 16 exstrophies. And if you plot it out, the curve drops back down to most of us getting to do 1 or 2 exstrophies a year if we're lucky. And what that means is that when you have a complex operation like that, nobody ever really gains the experience. And so, for these very, very unusual, specialized type problems, if you're going to go back to my first slide and say what's the best for the child, we really ought to be assembling teams that travel. There ought to be a handful, 6 or 7 people in the States, for example, and probably 3 or 4 people in Canada who have a special interest in exstrophy. And if Andrew's the guy here in Vancouver and anybody's born with exstrophy or Gorash or anybody, or John, if anybody's born with exstrophy in the Pacific Northwest, then maybe one of the 2 other exstrophy experts ought to fly there and work together and do that case and then review all of their numbers. And that ought to be the virtual exstrophy group. It shouldn't be hospital-based. It ought to be based online. And I believe that will also attract international business. And it's actually doable. The business plan is doable. Every hospital has to chip in a little bit, but I think you can grow it. And I think esophageal atresia is probably the same way. But my concern, going back to the topic of MIS, is that if everybody then begins to be trained in MIS, are we really going to push the horizons of MIS the way it should be? Are we going to actually push natural orifice surgery less? And all of those things that need to be pushed in children if everybody dilutes it out and we all do the ho-hum, 10 cases a year type thing. So these are things I wonder and worry about. This is a boy that just illustrates the point that I made before, that these incisions that you can see here and here at 6 weeks post-op are really pretty hard to find subsequently. And that's because these wounds that are small actually do heal with less of a scar than a longer one. And you can prove that in any animal. That's work that was done in the 70s. So for us to forget about all that stuff because we like to do abdominal surgery is not the right way to think about it. So since we started our robotic program at CHOP, we've done all of these various cases. Not all of them are perfect for the robot, but we felt like it's important to push it. These are the working ports, obviously. I think one of the areas that the adult urologists know about is bladder reconstruction. I think that as much as I love to do exstrophy surgery, some of that work will likely be done with the robot over time. I used to think that robotic surgery shouldn't be done with by anybody who isn't a really skilled laparoscopic surgeon, because if the robot fails, then you can't, you've got to then do an open operation. Now, I think that one of the reasons it's been, in the case of pyeloplasty, it's a big flank incision. I think in the case of pelvic operation, like a prostate, for example, even if you're not a skilled robotic surgeon, but you're a skilled prostate surgeon, I think the actual work is close enough. And the downside is in a prostate operation, you're going to make a relatively small operation to go and do it open if you have to. There might be an easier entry point. So if I get to do robotic surgery in my career, and I expect that I'll try to do that over the next few years, it'll be in the context of just the work that I'm doing in bladder exstrophy. So that I begin to gain experience in that way. this is the CHOP experience in pyeloplasty, and I'm really proud of these numbers. Here's the length of surgery, and if length of surgery is an example of skill, the time of surgery begins to be an example of skill. I'm sorry, this is length of stay. But in the OR, the minutes in the OR, Pat is actually almost as fast with the robot as we have been operatively for all comers. And this average number now is much closer to 96 minutes. So I now know that Pat can do these cases at least as quickly as we can open. And so there's been, but when you look at the robotic experience globally and compare Pat's numbers to others, it's not that Pat is a very gifted surgeon, but it's not the whole story. Part of the story is that he's done so much of it that docking the robot and all that stuff is, has become much easier for him. So, we've done pyelolithotomies with the robot. Pat's done 6 ureterocalicostomies. 9 ureterocalicostomies. That number's up to 12 now. And the future is basically out there now that this is new robotic snake head technology that has now been completely developed. There are going to be small little robots that are going to that ultimately will be used. This is augmented reality. Rick Satava here in this next slide, sort of showing you how virtual the virtual surgery is just around the corner with this, and also total integration of operative care anywhere is going to be real. Pat actually did a hypospadias with the robot because he wanted to show that the telesurgery would be possible even for open surgery, and so I think that all that stuff is out there. There is an end to this probably. I'm going to tell you just sort of one downside, and that is, the Columbia program, Columbia University program in urology had a number of people that have retired or left that program, which created this enormous vacuum just north of us. And so, much to my disappointment, although I'm very pleased for Pat, Pat's going to be heading up to Columbia to become their chief. And you might argue that that a program like ours, if we lose a superstar every 8 or 9 years to become chief of a major teaching program, then we're actually doing our job, as opposed to this being a calamity. But what happens then is that because we've subspecialized, if you lose your entire front line, you got to go hire a bunch of big guys that can play football. And with Pat and also Sarah Lambert, who also had ties to New York for other reasons, left. That was our entire robot program. So on January the 1st, 2nd, when I came back from my holiday, both of them, sent me a note, said they wanted to talk with me, and they both were leaving. I had to scramble. The good news is that when you have a program that is shunting as many patients as we are to a person who's focused and wants to be a laparoscopic surgeon, wants to do it, it's a very attractive job. And although I was worried that I wouldn't be able to fill it, as soon as the word went out, and I got to tell you, it went out like in nanoseconds, my phone began to ring off the hook from some of the best young robotics players throughout the country who I thought were solidified, to their program. They knew that Pat was getting an enormous amount of volume and had grown the program to such a degree, and the program is well funded. There's a surgical research arm that's well funded. I think if you do this, my initial fears that had to do with, how can we actually, refill these if we lose a key person, kind of goes away. And I'm sure that when I step down, there won't be any problem getting somebody who really likes to do exstrophy and really likes to do hypospadias work to come and take my job, because we're doing a big volume of it. And to close, we go back to Omega Prime here. I think that subspecialization can work if you've got a big enough team doing enough work. I think it requires a very cohesive team. You have to be able to balance the finances so that people don't feel like they're they're giving away their child's tuition money in order to play ball with Doug Canning. That has to be worked into it, and that's the source of another talk. I can show you how we've done it at CHOP to make sure everybody feels welcome and to make sure that everybody feels well compensated. I think it blends very well with a passionate mission that puts the child first, but it takes a great deal of maintenance. So that's really all I have. I'm happy to take questions. It's not really a surgical talk. It was more of an administrative talk, but for whatever that's worth, if anybody has questions, I'm happy to take a few. John.
So